Hello, I'd like to welcome all the students to this installment of MedTalk. We have the opportunity today to hear from Dr. Michael Kauffman, who's an esteemed and highly successful alumnus of our program. And throughout this event, I will say that the chat is disabled, so please ask your questions in the Q&A, and we'd like to get questions. The purpose of these med talks is really to give our students, PhD, MD, and MD, PhD, the opportunity to hear about physician scientist and scientist careers outside of what you encounter in the academic training environment. So I think today's speaker today will really highlight a remarkably successful career in a path that is not academic medicine or science. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Kauffman. At this point, again, remember, please ask your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to turn over the microphone to our fantastic Vice Dean of Education, Dr. Roy Ziegelstein.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I really appreciate it. And welcome to everybody, and particular welcome to our distinguished guest, Michael Kauffman, who, as you heard, is a physician scientist and an alum of our program and is a senior clinical advisor for Karyopharm Therapeutics. And it's going to be really a lot of fun, I think, for me to interview Dr. Kauffman with some of my own questions, but also with questions that some of you have submitted before this event. I wonder, Michael, if you could start off by just telling us a little bit about your background as a student here, and if you could sprinkle in every now and then how great Hopkins is, that would certainly be appreciated. And maybe also, you know, when you had the realization that this type of career would be the right one for you.
Sure. Thanks a lot. I started at Hopkins in 1985. I was at Amherst College. I did a BA in biochemistry, and I had a choice of several really good MD PhD programs for some of the ones that you guys compete with, and by far Al Milvan and the team at Hopkins made me an offer I couldn't refuse. We call it the Godfather offer. And it was just great to come down. And you never know when you choose a school, really, you know, sort of at the back end if it was good or not. But it turned out, honestly, to be a great experience. Mainly is determined by what happened to me afterwards. And you just go into your residency program and future research, and you just know whether you have the tools or not. And we'll get to that in a minute. So I entered 1985. I was always a bit of a heretic in the sense that I did the first year med school, and of course didn't love all the lectures. I think you guys have more stuff that's more hands-on now, thankfully, because it was brutal. And I realized the second year is mostly about what's going on in the clinic, and then most MD PhD students like to go and do their first 2 years and then go to the lab. It made no sense to me, so I did 1 year and then I went to the lab. So that I would know clinical medicine, after second year and continue in the clinic. I went to a guy called Tom Kelly, who at the time was the head of the Department of Molecular Biology, BCMB program, Biochemistry, Cell and Molecular Biology. He had worked with 2 Nobel Prize winners at Hopkins, who I think are retired, Hamilton Smith and Dan Nathan. And Tom was really a great, tough boss, and Tom didn't suffer, fools lightly. In fact, none of the Hopkins really suffered fools lightly, and that serves you well later on. He kicked my butt a lot in my PhD. It was a 4-year thing. I got my 3 papers out that I needed to get, 3 review papers, and it was prolific. And as Tom said at my thesis successful defense, he said, I wasn't really sure what Michael was doing, but at the end, it all came together. So that worked out well. I went back into the clinic. I did second year, and I did some of the tutoring of the first years, and I did third year, and then I ran off from Hopkins in '92. But I really I really had some great medicine on the clinic. I mean, it was just great training. And I can tell you all, and I guess we'll get to it in a little bit, that when I got to Beth Israel in Boston, and most of the residents had come from Harvard and Harvard hospitals who came in as interns and all, and from other places. And we Hopkins, I was the only one in that class, but we had a couple after. We were heads and tails above everybody. I mean, we were really well trained to the point where they didn't understand why we weren't asking for more supervision. And we looked at them like, why do we need supervision? We've been there and done that. So it was great training. I think in the end, looking back at my career, the foundations you get from the PhD program were solid as could be, as good as anywhere. And I still quote Tom today. And the medical training was really second to none. And I stand by that.
Thanks.
Roy, was that enough pluses for Hopkins? It's really true.
That was pretty good. I mean, I think I'm only in the hole 15 or 20 bucks right now. So I think I'm doing okay. That was really helpful. You know, I think that a lot of young people are looking for a very linear path to something. They don't always know what the something is, but a linear path. And yet I think we know that most of the paths are not linear. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the zigzags or nonlinear, and maybe some of the things that happened to you as a student that you really didn't expect?
Yeah, I first of all, you know, why did you go to do an MD PhD program? I mean, what do you really know in high school and college when you're thinking about being a nerd for anywhere between 6 and 8 or 9 years? And you don't really know that you want to do science and medicine, because frankly, you never know what medicine really is until you practice medicine. And you don't really get to practice medicine until you're at least a 4th year or 3rd year sub-internship and frankly, as a resident. And then that's the beginning of practicing medicine. And the laboratory experience you get in college is like dipping your toe in the ocean and feeling how cold it is, but it's just the beginning. So you don't really know, but you go and do this. And I always tell people who are asking me for career advice, would you go back and do a shorter program, the MD or the PhD? What would you do? And I say, look, the way I think about it is that you're learning foundations. Start with the fact that you're probably all going to live to about 100 years old, give or take. You don't have to be in a rush. I was in a rush, and I'm glad I was in a rush because I couldn't relax. But I think even with my kids today, I'm not nearly as in much of a rush with them as I was myself. And I don't think you need to rush. I think what you do need to get is a great foundation. And the beauty of the MD PhD program, and it is that, you know, Dr. Ziegelstein has done cardiology research. Andrea has done research. She's got an MD PhD. You don't need a PhD to do medical research, but it helps. And you pay the piper one place or the other, and it's fine. You can learn it when you're doing a postdoc after you finish your MD, or you can learn it in your PhD and be that much further ahead. I'm glad I spent the time. It is a long, tough program for sure, but you're learning 2 different languages. And don't let anyone kid you. These are 2 very different languages. Even today, you know, medicine is not science and science is not medicine. And the twain do need to meet. And it's one of the great things about academic institutions is they get to meet. And I didn't appreciate a lot of this stuff, but I do give you the advice that don't short shrift it, because it's very hard to get back. I mean, life gets in the way, you know, stuff happens, you want to do stuff. And now's your chance to really get a foundation. So when I left Hopkins to do my internal medicine residency, I had no doubt I wanted to be an internist who had a laboratory that studied human disease directly as best as possible. And I wasn't quite sure yet whether it was going to be in cancer or in immunology. Back then, immunology was mostly phenomenology. Cancer was brutal. Back then, it was abominable. To be blunt. And I turned out during my residency that I just couldn't literally stomach it. We didn't have supportive care. We didn't have targeted drugs. It was really tough. We were just starting to cure some of the diseases in '92, beyond testicular cancer and Hodgkin's, early stage Hodgkin's, but there wasn't anything very beautiful about it. And I know that Dr. Cox is an oncologist, and I'm not trying to be pejorative. I'd probably be an oncologist today if I went back, but back then I couldn't because it was just too tough. So I became a rheumatologist. But what I learned in medicine was that we can do amazing things. one of my favorite experiences at Hopkins was as a sub-intern. I was at I don't know if you call it the Francis Scott Key Medical Center. I don't think you call it that anymore. The East Campus.
It's Bayview now.
Okay.
Bayview.
But I was there and I was a sub-intern in medicine, and I got to really do medicine. And it was a little easier back then. Things were not quite as stringent as they are now. So we wrote orders and we were treated pretty much as interns, and they had to have the orders co-signed by residents. Staffing was really short over there back then. And we just dove in, and luckily I didn't make too many mistakes. One thing I did learn was that you just got to treat the nurses super well, because frankly, they know a lot more than you do for a long time, and they know the practical stuff. And I just give you the advice, keep that in mind as you go to your residency. Plus, they'll be nicer to you. They won't wake you up all night if they like you and you treat them well. But I think just learning how to do that kind of stuff, running a couple of patients who were in acute pulmonary edema, with decompensated congestive heart failure, and running those cases and getting the people upright and doing all the LMNOP, mnemonics, and all the stuff you do. Of course, we've got 4 or 5 drugs now that we never had back then, and we add those too. But just watching a patient go from literally drowning in their own fluid to 30 minutes later talking, and being so thankful that you saved their life, really made a huge impression. We had, as one of my professors at Hopkins used to call it, we had wondermycins. It was the beginning of some of the 2nd and 3rd generation cephalosporins, and most of the bugs, except for at the Veterans Hospital, we could mostly treat most patients with antibiotics that were highly likely to work. And it was really amazing. Fungal disease was still a nightmare. Back then, it's much better now. It's still not perfect, but it's far better now than it was. And these things had a huge impact on me. When I went to my residency, we had some patients. We had really, really sick patients, obviously, coming in, and every year the patients that are admitted to a hospital get sicker, because frankly, keeping people out of the hospital is one of our great achievements in medicine. So when they finally have to come in, it's usually a multi-pronged, multifactorial, plus usually older, tough situation, and we can do a lot, and that's just talking generally in medicine. These kinds of events had amazing. I'll tell you one last story, and I'll go back to Roy. I was at the VA hospital, and I was the resident, 2nd-year resident, and you're in charge. And I was at the ICU, intensive care unit, and we had 12 people in 12 beds, all sick as hell. Most people had no lung function left because they had smoked most of their life. It's a veterans hospital. There was a lot of background alcoholism, so liver dysfunction and so on and so forth. I had one of the nicest guys, and we could not get him off the ventilator. 75-year-old guy, his lungs were wet. He had heart failure, and he had COPD with emphysema, and a bit of chronic bronchitis, but mostly emphysema, which means he had no lung tissue left. And we couldn't get him off the vent, and his lungs were wet. And, we couldn't really diurese him with standard agents because you kill his kidneys, and his heart didn't work real well. So we start to diurese him, and he'd go get hypotensive. Long story short, after having a big fight with the attending, and I don't recommend this for everyone, but I'll just tell you what made a difference to me. I brought up, why don't we use some intravenous aminophylline, which back then was one of the few drugs we had which could actually increase lung muscle function. At least we thought that's what it did. It also is a great diuretic, and probably that's what helped the guy. But the attending said, no way, the randomized studies haven't worked. I said, but this guy's going to go out of here on a tracheostomy and be on a ventilator for the rest of his life. So anyway, he went home, and I took the risky chance to start the patient on aminophylline. We kept an eye on his heart rate and so on. And actually the guy had, he peed out 4 liters of fluid overnight. His lungs dried up, his kidneys stayed stable. We were all waiting for that creatinine the next morning. And the next morning was Saturday morning, and the attending didn't show up until Sunday when we were about to extubate the patient. We did extubate him. He walked out of that intensive care unit home, direct discharge from the ICU, home in clothes, able to walk with a walker, and not on any kind of ventilation or anything. So, it wasn't a cure by any means, but man, we gave this gentleman life, and those kinds of things really got me excited about the potential for medicine.
It's obvious, I think, to everybody hearing the stories, how much these, are you not hearing me? Can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
Okay.
Hear me, I don't hear you, Roy.
I don't know why Michael can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Sandra, anything? There we go.
Okay, good. It's obvious, I think, Michael, to everybody, how much these clinical stories, the patient care, really have stayed with you all these years and likely influenced you throughout your career. Could you just tell us a little bit about what you actually do in your role at Karyopharm?
Sure. So what got me into biotech, and the thing that I guess I should have answered last time, but I got caught up in my cases, was really two. One was the Zofran or ondansetron trial, which is a drug for nausea. It was a breakthrough drug at the time. It's generic now. We take it for granted. We give it to pregnant women also. But back then it was for severely nausea and vomiting inducing chemotherapy, and still is. And it's really the cornerstone of that. Changed the game really in cancer therapy and made some of the life-saving drugs possible. We were doing a study of that in my residency at Beth Israel, and it was very clear who was getting. It was a blinded study, meaning you didn't know what people were getting, placebo or ondansetron, but it was very clear who was getting ondansetron and who wasn't, to the point where it almost felt unethical to give people placebo. We knew it before anybody knew it. There was a grand rounds lecture about the reflux medicine Prilosec and patients who had been in trials on that, and it was just a breakthrough. Now it's over the counter. We take it for granted. And lastly, when I was at my fellowship in rheumatology at Mass General, and we were doing a trial with infliximab, which was the first anti-tumor necrosis factor alpha therapy for rheumatoid arthritis. First of all, the title of TNF alpha was confusing because we thought it was going to be something you didn't want to inhibit. It would cause tumors if you blocked it. And why it would work in rheumatoid arthritis in those days, no one knew. But as a rheumatologist and someone with who studies joint disease and takes care of people who can't move, we knew who was getting the placebo and who was getting the infliximab, because you just have to shake their hand and it would work in a day. Every patient who got infliximab came in and shook your hand and actually shook it, whereas the patients on placebo were still rigid and stuck. And it was clearly a breakthrough, and it's some of the most important medicines we have in rheumatology today. And this, coupled with one of my attendings at my fellowship, who was working also as vice president of clinical at a pharmaceutical company, said, Michael, you have a great science background. You love medicine. You got to come and put these together at a company and make new medicines. And I tell you, you just didn't leave Hopkins and Harvard and go to the dark side. That's what we called it back then. You just didn't do that. It took me 6 months to agree to go for an interview, and he really put pressure. They were looking for a doctor who would run a lupus program and some other autoimmune diseases. And it turned out I was sort of subspecializing already in lupus. And after 6 months, I finally said, okay, Irving, I'll go do the talk, I'll spend the day. So they tortured me from 7:30 in the morning until 6:30 at night. I had to give a talk on, the current treatment landscape in lupus and everything. And that was, they came back to me 2 days later and say, we want to hire you, which meant giving up an academic career, although it was sort of slotted in with the rheumatology fellowship as research and it counted. But obviously leaving that to go to the quote dark side, which I think most people agree now. We have a great partnership with academia. We work with Hopkins a ton, as you can imagine, on our cancer drugs and so on. So that gets me over there. My whole life has been spent on new drugs now, and I still keep my board certification in internal medicine. And I practiced for a couple of years while I was at pharma, but it was too tough because, of course, patients get sick when they get sick, and you always seem to be on an airplane on business when they're really sick. So I really had to give it up, the day to day. But I still keep my license, and I'll write for anybody who needs Ambien to sleep. I'll be happy to help you. What I do now, when I was CEO, and that was for 10 years, and that was a great amount of time. It was my second CEO-ship. It was the third drug I got approved, or I shouldn't say I because it's a team, but was instrumental in getting approved. 3 drugs, all 3 were for multiple myeloma. This most recent drug also is approved already in lymphoma, and we have a big phase 3 trial in uterine cancer coming up in the maintenance setting. And I think it's basically a fundamental mechanism that it attacks. So I think it'll go other places. But as a CEO of a company, which I sort of grew into, and I never got a business degree, I spent about 30% of my time dealing with the investment world and making sure that people knew why they should own our stock when we were public, and before we became public as a private company, talking about the dream of treating cancer with a new oral therapy and a whole new way of approaching cancer that got at some of the hallmarks of cancer. And I have to tell you, I never had a better job in my life with this particular project. It was so exciting. I used to, tell my wife, who actually invented the drug, and we worked on this together, and also my mom, that this is just a great honor to be able to do this kind of thing. And we worked our asses off, obviously, pardon the language. It's great. I spend 30% of my time working on the science aspects. And even to this day, my current job is about 60% reviewing papers and presentations and everything, which is what I really like to do. I probably have 100 publications now as part of a team from Karyopharm, our company. So we take that all very seriously. And about 30% of my time was actually spent on the phone with doctors treating patients and what's called medical monitoring. That's a little atypical for most CEOs. Most CEOs are not as medically focused as I was, but I just like the medicine the most. Once our drug became commercial and was on the market, we clearly needed a CEO that was going to spend 80% of his time in commercial and 20% of his time on investors and leave the medicine to the rest of us, which is now what's happened, which is great because I get to do the fun stuff. So that's how it's broken down now. But the whole evolution from idea of a new therapy for human disease to the publications that have to go with it, to the convincing, of course, people to fund it, because without money, it's like a car without gasoline or without electric battery. You just can't do it. But this it's been a great time, and anybody can look up my on PubMed just to see how serious we are about actually producing and reporting on what we've done.
Thanks for explaining that, Michael. I think.
Oops, I lost you again. Sorry. Now I got you.
Okay, I think I said thank you for explaining what you do. I think it's really helpful for people to hear. And I also think it's important for people to hear how things have evolved. As you said, from the time when you were here, when going into industry, entrepreneurship and so forth was considered, as you said, the dark side, to use your words. I think now we are very much embracing of diverse career paths, and also recognize, as you correctly pointed out, the partnerships between industry and academia. I wonder if you could let people know, if you had to pick a few skills, or characteristics or traits that are helpful for you in your current role, what would they be?
Yeah, so thanks. I have a quick answer because we actually have a company culture that has the mnemonic. Everything in medicine has to have a mnemonic so you can remember it, right? So we have iCure, and of course these days everything has to have a little I in it. And I'll get to that. But the most important thing you have to have, I think, in our business, if you want to think about coming up with a new medicine, first of all, you got to know that the failure rate is somewhere in the 95 to 98% range. Now, if you try to go in and excite people about it, and you want to walk in with that attitude, you're not going to get anybody excited about it. So you have to know it in your head, but in your heart, you have to be an optimist, and you have to come out with energy and optimism. And it is, you can see it in me because I'm excited about new medicines. I just think it's just fun. It's great to say a patient comes in, they're scared to death, and you can give them something. And it's because of all of us, everybody in the room here, academia, the pharmaceutical companies, the patient advocacy groups, frankly, getting together and helping these medicines get to the market where they can really help people. The mnemonic iCure, starting with optimism, which is outside of it, is innovation. So you should do something innovative. There are people that go into generics, and it's fine. Generics are really important for the economy and everything else, but that's not why you're at Hopkins, to be really snobby about this. You're not at Hopkins to do generic medicine. So please, use your innovation, use your remarkable talents to do that. C is courage. It's part of the optimism, but this is scary shit, and you'll pardon my mouth, you're going to put a new molecule into a human being. And there is no more terrifying event than that 24 hours after that drug went into the person, if they are still alive. And I remember those sleepless nights with that. And that's what you have to do, because there is patient number one on your drug that has never. Now you're going to test it in at least 2 species. We did it in 4. And going into primates is also pretty scary, because nobody wants to hurt any animal. But to be blunt, if you're going to hurt a monkey, you're going to feel a lot worse than if a few mice went down because of it. Just the nature of the way things are. So courage is super important. And you also have to have the courage when things don't go so well. Sick people, I have a smart alecky remark, sick people get sicker and bad stuff happens to them. And frankly, cancer patients, which I've dealt with now for 20 years, if they don't die of their cancer, they're going to probably die of heart disease or some diabetes related complication, often a cardiovascular event. And, we have heart attacks because 75-year-old people who are on 5 medicines and have 6 different cardiac risk factors who also have cancer actually die more often of cancer than they do, die more often of cardiac disease. You got to have the courage. Urgency, especially today, and not just because the investment community is, impatient. Urgency because the patients are really waiting. You getting a drug out there sooner or getting a clinical trial started earlier will make the difference for some people about whether they have a second shot or a 5th shot, and living a bit longer, and maybe even living a lot longer than dying, to be blunt. So if you're working in a serious disease, you could be the difference between somebody's life or death. And I now have, I think in our company, we've treated about 10,000 patients. There are probably 1,000 of them that have done remarkably well. And I mean, they are living way beyond expectation. And if it's not just our drug, it's because our drug was around long enough so that they could get the next breakthrough. And keep that in mind. So urgency is super important. Resilience. There is probably no more important thing besides optimism than resilience. You will get knocked down. We had our first compound we wanted to take into the clinic. It went into monkeys. It was a test going on in China. It went into the poor monkeys, developed dopamine overload. And we didn't expect it. They came out and they were flailing around, and we got the videos, and we were ill. I mean, it was tough to watch. First, then we thought maybe they had malaria, because most of them did in that Chinese colony of monkeys. We couldn't tell if they had CNS malaria. I mean, it was a mess. Anyway, it turned out the compound was actually quite useful for Parkinson's, and it has been licensed by another company for study of neurological diseases, but it wasn't going to work in cancer. So you got to have resilience. We got knocked down. We called our investors. We said, we have a 3 to 6 month delay, and we're not really sure. It sucks. But but we believe in ourselves, and we're going to solve this. And we told them, and we said it. Pardon, my dog is a bit excited. And then the last one is energy. And you got to have a lot of energy. Now, if you can get through a Hopkins Ph.D. or residency, I don't know how you did the OSR service, to tell you the truth. And you can do this, but it's energy over time, and you got to be excited about it. So those are the things. I think if you remember iCure: innovation, courage, urgency, and resilience and energy, it would be helpful.
Thanks for sharing that. I actually wrote it down. I think it actually would be OI cure, because there's optimism at the beginning, but my question for you now, this is sort of the point where I'm leading the witness. Were you born with all of these IQ traits and characteristics, or did Hopkins help you along the way?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Hopkins helped a lot. Amherst College helped a lot. My high school was okay; it was fine. It wasn't that challenging. But certainly college and Hopkins. My residency actually was easier than Hopkins. To be honest, it was obviously more exhausting because we were on call every third night. But it was easier in a lot of ways. I think the one thing you learn at Hopkins, and this was true in the Ph.D. and the medicine wards, and even on the surgical rotations, which I really hated, is that the truth was always the most important thing. Getting as best to the right answer as you could and the best outcomes for the patients was the most important thing. And not just kind of nice stuff, not just being kind to everybody. And I tell people, I say to my employees, I don't know what you're talking about when we have got human health on the line here. These are cancer patients. We have to help them. So I think Hopkins did a lot. And I think the training there, these are hard times, but if you go through them early in life, it's so much easier to deal with the difficulties. You learn stuff at Hopkins, a lot of it's been learned. When you get out into the quote real world and you're dealing with new diseases and new drugs, mostly new drugs these days, and the interactions of those drugs with complicated patients, you better be prepared for some hits. You better be prepared to get knocked down and get up. And Hopkins really, really helped me there.
Thanks, Michael. I actually have three very more specific questions, if it's okay, including one I'm going to take in from the Q&A part of that's been written in the QA. The first question is, what advice would you give to a PhD student who plans to attend medical school after graduating?
Yeah, the first thing, and I'll be blunt. I think the curriculum now is probably a lot better than it was back then, but medicine is a ton of memorization. It's like learning a language where you're given the vocabulary list of 500 new words, which is almost as many bones in the foot as there are. And you're just told to learn them. And it's not from first principles, and nobody was around when evolution was deciding how our anatomy was set up and the funny, glycolytic pathways that went into the Krebs cycle and went into oxphos and so on. None of us were there to invent that stuff, and it just kind of is. Now, you learned a lot of that stuff in PhD in the biochemistry side, but you didn't learn pathophysiology and histopathology, and frankly, you didn't learn much pharmacology either. So you got to memorize a lot. And I think it's very hard if you've done a PhD when you've started with first principles and lectures kind of built upon themselves. Anatomy is, here's the bones in the skull, here's the parts of the brain, this is what they're called, this is how they're connected. We sort of kind of know how it all works a little bit and memorize it. And then we're going to give you a test question where we cut through a slice and you're just going to have to mark them, where it is. And I think you just got to prepare yourself with that. I think that the advantage you have, though, is to try to add the scientific principles to what you're learning in the medicine. And I actually enjoyed that because the pure medicine doesn't get into the deep thinking about how it all works. There's not enough time because it's so complicated. When you get to pharmacology, you get to play as well. So try to enjoy it, but go in with eyes wide open that you're going to spend a lot of time learning vocabulary lists, and it's going to be a little bit brutal at first until you sort of get the swing of things.
Thanks. And if I could just pause for a second to remind people that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll try my best to get to them. A second question, again, specific question is, do you suggest that a student gets an MD who wants to be involved in clinical trials?
I can tell you from the people we work with, I think every single doctor that we work with in clinical trials is an MD. There's an occasional PhD who works with MDs who you can get. They cannot be I believe it's an FDA regulation. It's certainly if not a company policy, it's just the nature of things that the person who signs off on the documents, the form is called 1572 from the FDA, and there's an equivalent one in Europe and so on, has to have an MD. So I think if you really want to do clinical trials, certainly the medical aspects and the patient interface, you can have a PhD, but you can't be the main person. If you want to do the translational work, you can get involved in clinical trials that way with a pure PhD. For those people that want to, and don't mind the torture of medical school, because it's tough, and it's a lot. It's a great language to learn, and there is a language of medicine. And remember that most science is reductionist, and we change one variable at a time. No patient I ever met actually ever did one change at a time. I mean, they're people, they have lots of stuff going on, not to mention the 60, 70, or 80 years they have behind them of accumulated stuff. So I think if you want to be in clinical trials, get the MD and get involved in clinical trials as soon as you can. It's a bit of an art. Once you get the training, you really can start. There are people that become clinical trialists and move from in academic positions to different places to set up their clinical trials unit. And it's an increasingly important and exciting area.
Thanks, Michael. So speaking of getting involved with things as quickly as you can, this question relates to advice you might have for medical students who, while they're in school, are interested in drug discovery, development, and commercialization. How should they get involved while they're students?
One of the things I did when I went to Biogen, they sent me on a one-week course to just would happen to be Tufts Medical School, because the Tufts School for Drug Development, because it was 10 miles away, and I immersed myself for 5 days in that, just to learn the lingo. Again, a lot of it is just the language that you use, what's a phase 1, 2, and 3 trial, and the amusing fact that the FDA doesn't even call them phase 1, 2, 3, the industry does. The safety reporting, the efficacy measures, and so on and so forth. I think you really have to get trained. This is not stuff that's easily learned on your own. It's not where you can open up a book on drug development. It's just the nature of it. You kind of have to hear about it and then try to get involved in it. Get involved at Hopkins. I mean, gosh, you guys have hundreds of clinical trials going on. Try to get involved in it, even if it's just moving data from A to B. Someday in the not too distant future, data will move itself from A to B, but we're still doing it a little bit by ourselves now. And I think that's the way you really learn this stuff. It took me 2 years. It was like another residency to really learn drug development. And that was pretty fast because there are people that, it takes a lot longer than that. And then obviously filing and getting a new drug approved is a lot different than just putting a drug in a person the first time. And that's just a career building thing that you just do. If you catch it on the tail end at a company, great. But you don't have the ownership or the appreciation. So I suggest if you're going to go into this, get some courses, talk to some of the professors who do a lot of clinical trials, ask them what you can do. They're always looking for extra hands, and learn as much as you can. Just be a sponge.
Thanks, Michael. So you've really explained to our students and others how things have changed in the last 30 years or so. Maybe even more relevant to this audience, what do you think will happen in the field in the next 5, 10, or even more years? And what advice do you have for our students to help implement the changes that you would like to see happen?
Yeah, I love this question. I could probably dwell on for way too long. We are at an inflection point, and you often hear this. The genome was cloned in 2000. The announcement of the human genome cloning, that was like finding out who the actors were in the play and not having any idea really what the plot was. And I was at a genomics company, and our thing that we were going to do was we were going to find genomically derived medicines. And we make all these cynical remarks about, yeah, we did a lot of big business deals, raised a heck of a lot of money, and bought other people's medicines they had already invented and got them approved, which is also laudable, but had nothing to do with understanding the human genome. We are finally reaping, I think, the benefits of genomically derived medicines that with targets. Of course, they are genomically derived because ultimately every protein comes from the genome. I mean, some of the stuff we say is kind of silly. We have systems biology now as if there were any other kind of biology. But we're at a time now when we can take advantage of this. So the fields that are emerging that I see are stuff that we didn't even contemplate back then. We have subpopulation targeted cancer drugs where, you biopsy a patient's tumor, and if they have a genomically derived or a genetically driven tumor, oncogene driven tumor, I'll give you an example. ALK, there's an ALK gene that drives 2 or 3% of lung cancers. We had nothing for these folks before they were dead in a year or two, and Andrea knows this better than I. And now we've got drugs, first, second, and third generation drugs that keep these people. I met one. I was at a party the other day. This guy comes in. He said, I've had lung cancer for 10 years. I looked at him like he was nuts. He said, no, it's ALK driven. I'm on an oral therapy. It's my second one. The first one lasted 7 years. This one's 3. This is unheard of. This never happened before. We move on to things like talking about cell-based therapies now. We have, chimeric T cell, modified T cells for things like lymphoma and acute lymphoblastic leukemia and so on. These are remarkable therapies. We are starting to do modifications of cell therapy for hemoglobinopathies like sickle cell disease and thalassemias. And we're starting to alter the genome in people. We're actually editing genomes now in people. And this is unbelievable. We had a Nobel Prize a few years ago that had to do with the editing systems, and we're implementing it. We have a vaccine for COVID that no one could have contemplated would be ready in the amount of time that it took for Pfizer and Moderna to come up with, or BioNTech, Pfizer/Moderna, to come up with a breakthrough method of vaccination that we never could do. We've got regenerative medicine that's starting to take hold. I mean, I could go on and on. My point is that we've got, last one I'll point out is we've got antibodies now that can be engineered to do almost anything you want. Whereas when I was growing up in medicine, we were lucky to have one monoclonal antibody approved a year. Now we've got dozens for diseases as diverse as cancer to rare diseases and so on. And we've got messenger RNA-based therapeutics for rare diseases. So everything you just heard tells you that you really have to learn a lot of molecular biology and biochemistry, but especially molecular biology, to be able to speak the language of modern medicine, because it's becoming molecular. Even immunology, which used to be kind of a laughing matter of growth factors, now there are actually genes involved and receptors and things. So I think for everybody in medicine, whether you're an MD or MD PhD or a PhD that wants to do medicine, PhDs, you already know this stuff for the most part, and you can speak that language. The MDs, you have to get learned in molecular biology. You go take a course or go sit on a lecture on CRISPR-9 gene editing. Go take a course on what it means, a CAR T cell. Go take a course in molecular immunology, or take a few lectures at least, so you can start to get fluent in this language, because medicine is going to become increasingly molecular, and the sort of old drugs, the beta blockers and everything else will have been a great foundation for us. But we're moving to a much more advanced and much more scientifically driven, rather than sort of pharmacologically driven types of therapies in the future, I think, and especially in the biopharma industry.
Thanks very much, Mike. I think I can comfortably say for you, me, and Andrea, to all the young people, we're happy. And I think we also recognize that the future is incredibly bright in science and medicine. So thanks for saying that. I wonder if I could just shift a little bit to a slightly different topic, which is, as somebody who went into industry how do you balance commercial interests with making drugs accessible and affordable?
Yeah, that's how, if I had the answer to this, Roy, I probably would be on an island somewhere that I owned. And I'd still try to answer the question. The problem is that and you hear this a lot, but it's actually true. The FDA is requiring ever more safety data, and they damn well should. People are sicker than they ever were, and we're giving new drugs to the sicker people, and we have to understand them. They're also more complicated, and they're also sicker in different ways across the spectrum of people with, say, breast cancer. You know, any young people with breast cancer who have very few comorbidities to people that are 70 who have 10 comorbidities. You've got very different situations and populations, and you have a base of therapies that are okay. I mean, they're not curative. We need to make more breakthroughs, but you've got things that sort of work, and now we have to do better. So the costs of doing all of this stuff are enormous. Every patient we put on a trial is $120,000. If we ever get to the point where we can put a patient on a trial, the total cost of a single patient to treat in a new drug trial for cancer is around 120 grand. So if you do 1,000 patients, it's $1.2 billion just for the clinical trials, including salaries and everything. Okay. At some point, somebody pays for this. Now, America has luckily taken the lead in the world that we as taxpayers, for the most part, and through our insurances, pay for all of this stuff because drugs are priced higher here than almost anywhere else in the world. Not everywhere, but almost anywhere else. We also have more drugs available, as far as I know, and this is talking about a lot of countries, than any other country. And people often come here, you know, the medical concierge therapy, people fly in if they can afford it from other countries to get stuff. It doesn't answer how we're going to do it. I won't get into the fight that we are having as an industry against, frankly, the insurers, because our job is to come up with innovative medicines and make sure that we can make enough profit so that people keep investing in us so that we can make more innovative medicines. There are a group of people that think we should cut the prices way down, and maybe we'll have the innovation we did. I personally don't subscribe to that. I think there's been a lot more learned people that have written on this. I think if you cut a cancer drug down from 20,000 a month to 10,000 a month, and I'm talking about a pill, most of the people that couldn't afford 20 still can't afford the 10. So the problem isn't in the 10 or the 20. The problem is the insurance can pay for it. And mostly today, most insurance companies eventually get around to paying for it, or the companies provide it for free. But there's no easy answer to all of this. There is the issue, and I believe it, that we got to ask the question. Insurers' job is to make sure that people have, you know, protection from having to spend a lot of money. But if they're making a ton of money, then that means some people are paying too much somewhere. And they're not really innovating, with all due respect to the insurers. So there's a big push right now to look at the system holistically, including looking at the cost of drugs. The other part of cost of drugs, of course, if I can give you an oral BTK inhibitor, for example, for CLL, and you don't have to come into the hospital and get horrible FCR, you know, fludarabine with cyclo and rituximab intravenously and be sick as hell and all that, I'm saving money. And in fact, in a lot of cases you are, and it gets really complicated. It's honestly, that part of it's going to get worse. And one of my medical school colleagues at Hopkins is actually in this whole area, and he's an MD JD because he likes to look at the ethics of all this, and it's so complicated. But I'll just finish by saying, if we want to have all these breakthroughs with gene therapy, which by the way are $1 million to $2 million a patient, not 10,000, and we want to have, you know, CAR T cells, which are $500,000 give or take, and we want to have messenger RNAs kinds of things, they're going to cost money. And ultimately, I don't think America should have to foot the whole bill. Personally, I think we've let Europe, and I'll be blunt, I think we've let Europe get away with half pricing most of our drugs here. And that means we're footing the bill and they're getting a lot of the same benefits. So I think we need to try to be more equitable across the world. And I think we need to look at the whole system. But keep in mind, we all want new options. When you're sick as hell and you're dying, you want to know that there's something that you can try next.
Thanks for explaining that. Before I ask my last question, I want to thank you, Michael, on behalf of everybody here for spending time with us and sharing your story and life lessons from OI cure to everything else. I really want to thank you. I'm just going to ask one final question, and then after your answer, turn things over to Andrea to close. Other than being interviewed here by me, is there anything you would do differently in your life?
No, I really enjoy these. And I think, honestly, to all of you younger people out there, I think one of the things we're missing a little bit in our world today, and I think you guys probably have more leadership at Hopkins than most places, and it's super important, is this sense of optimism. Because everyone likes to be a cynic and a complainer and this is wrong and I can do it better. And if they would only do this and tweak that and whatever. And I just think it's crazy. We have come so far since I graduated medical school almost 30 years ago as a field. I like to joke, we're not really practicing most medicine anymore. We actually got it right for the most part. We have made amazing strides. We have a long way to go. And part of that depends on what your definition of success is, because if it's immortality for everyone, sure, we have a really long way to go. But if it's letting people live a good, healthy, quality life as long as possible, and then eventually when their time comes to sort of just for it to come, that's a different thinking. I want you all, I hope you all can take some optimism away from this. You should have it. You are in a great field. I am so happy I got the training I did, and I mean this sincerely. And I'm so happy I went into the industry because I enjoy the science mixed with the medicine better than the day-to-day patient. And the patient stuff is great. I do miss it. I also miss teaching. And I think you guys have a lot to look forward to in your life and careers, and see where life takes you. And the breakthroughs are coming. None of us can predict them. And it's cause for great optimism and excitement, and it's only going to get better.
Thank you. I'll turn things over to Andrea and really appreciate your spending time with us here today.
Really my pleasure.
So Dr. Kauffman, those are great closing remarks. I share your admiration for all those who've really transformed what we've learned in science that has enabled us to take better care of our patients and help them live longer, better lives. So thank you for all you've done personally to change the standard of care for patients, applying your scientific expertise you acquired here to really make a difference in people's lives. I found it very inspiring. I'm definitely gonna remember the eye cure. I have to think about if I want to say OI cure. It sounds better from Dr. Ziegelstein, I think. But I really like the eye cure acronym, and I hope our students came away with a sense of optimism, because I have no doubt that, as you have done, we continue to train people who will really make a difference in science and medicine going forward. So thanks to everyone for attending and for your excellent questions, including yours, Dr. Ziegelstein. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks so much.